Picture this. You're in a library in Alexandria, around 200 CE. The scrolls around you contain the greatest achievements of human thinking: Aristotle's logic, Plato's dialogues, centuries of refined philosophical reasoning. You've mastered these tools. You can debate anyone, analyze anything, categorize the entire cosmos. But then something happens. Maybe it's while reading about the martyrdom of early Christians or contemplating the mystery of your own consciousness. Suddenly, all that brilliant thinking feels insufficient, like trying to capture the ocean in a teacup. You're experiencing what happened to an entire civilization. Between the death of Aristotle and the rise of medieval philosophy, human consciousness went through a profound transformation. Thought, which had been humanity's newest superpower, suddenly encountered its own limitations. Something else was awakening. This is the story of when thought lost its wings and discovered something even more extraordinary. For centuries, Greek philosophy had been humanity's great adventure. From Thales wondering about water to Aristotle systematizing everything, thinking had become increasingly sophisticated. But by the 1st century CE, something curious was happening. Imagine being a Stoic philosopher in Rome. You've spent decades perfecting your understanding of virtue, studying how to align with cosmic reason, developing logical proofs for why death shouldn't be feared, and emotions should be mastered through rational discipline. Your philosophical system is intellectually bulletproof. You can debate anyone and win. But then you encounter something unexpected. A Christian who doesn't just talk about divine love as a philosophical principle, but claims to experience it as a living presence. They describe a direct, personal relationship with the divine that transforms their entire being. They speak of peace that surpasses understanding, of being filled with a love that changes everything. What's unsettling isn't that they're wrong. It's that their experience points to something your sophisticated philosophical system never quite reached. You realize you've been thinking about virtue, analyzing cosmic order, constructing rational arguments about the divine. But have you ever actually touched the reality these concepts point toward? Your perfectly constructed rational system suddenly feels hollow. Not wrong necessarily, but incomplete, like having a detailed map of a country you've never actually visited. Rudolf Steiner observed something profound about this period. The Greeks had discovered thought, but they hadn't fully discovered the thinker. Greek philosophy was still somewhat impersonal, cosmic reason flowing through human minds. But now, something new was stirring: true self-consciousness. Think about your own experience for a moment. When you meditate deeply, don't you sometimes discover a witnessing awareness behind your thoughts? That capacity to observe yourself thinking represents a massive evolutionary leap in consciousness. This is what was emerging collectively during the early Christian era. But here's the fascinating part. This awakening self-consciousness initially felt terrifying. The Greeks lived in a cosmos where everything had its place, where human reason participated in divine reason. Suddenly, people were experiencing themselves as separate, isolated, alone with their own consciousness. Into this crisis stepped some of the most remarkable explorers of consciousness in Western history, the Gnostics. Now, popular culture often portrays them as mysterious cultists with secret knowledge. But look deeper, and you discover something extraordinary. They were actually the first Western psychologists. The Gnostics weren't describing abstract theology when they spoke of the pleroma, the aeons, the fall of Sophia. They were mapping the actual territories of consciousness with remarkable precision. Carl Jung recognized this. He called the Gnostics the first to concern themselves with the contents of the collective unconscious. Their elaborate cosmologies weren't meant to be taken literally. They were psychological maps. Take their concept of the demiurge, the false creator who mistakes himself for the ultimate reality. Jung saw this as the perfect description of ego consciousness when it becomes inflated, thinking it's the whole of reality rather than just one aspect of the psyche. Or consider Sophia, divine wisdom who falls into matter and must find her way back to the light. The Gnostics spoke in rich metaphors that captured something profound about consciousness, exploring itself through incarnation, how awareness can lose itself in identification with form, and how it eventually remembers its true nature. Clement of Alexandria represents a fascinating figure in this transformation. Trained in Greek philosophy, he could debate with the best of them, but he made a remarkable discovery. Philosophy could take you to the threshold of ultimate truth, but something else was needed to cross it. He famously called philosophy a schoolmaster leading to Christ. Not because he was diminishing reason, but because he'd discovered reason's proper place in the hierarchy of knowing. It's like using a telescope to study the stars, incredibly valuable, but you don't mistake the telescope for the sky itself. Origen took this even further, creating elaborate philosophical systems that integrated Platonic concepts with Christian revelation. But notice what's happening. Even when these thinkers used Greek concepts, they subordinated reason to something beyond reason, what they called revelation, gnosis, or direct spiritual experience. Here's where the story gets really interesting. The early Christian mystics moved beyond philosophical speculation about transcendent states. They developed actual technologies for accessing them: fasting, vigils, contemplative prayer, meditation on sacred texts. They became pioneers of consciousness exploration. Modern neuroscience is now validating what they discovered experientially. When researchers study the brains of experienced meditators and mystics, they find something remarkable. During profound spiritual experiences, the default mode network, the brain region responsible for self-referential thinking, actually decreases in activity. This ego dissolution corresponds exactly to what the mystics described. The thinking self must die for direct spiritual knowing to arise. They were mapping consciousness states that neuroscience is only beginning to understand. Perhaps no figure illustrates this transformation more powerfully than the mysterious writer known as Pseudo-Dionysius. Working in the 5th or 6th century, he developed what became known as negative theology, the radical idea that ultimate reality could only be approached by saying what it was not. His insight was profound. The absolute is beyond all categories of thought. Every concept, no matter how elevated, becomes a limitation when applied to the infinite. To reach ultimate truth, consciousness must transcend its own operations. He wrote of entering the dazzling darkness where knowing becomes unknowing. This wasn't anti-intellectual pessimism. It was the recognition that consciousness has modes beyond conceptual thought. Think about this for a moment. When you have your most profound experiences, falling in love, witnessing natural beauty, moments of deep peace, aren't they often beyond words? The mystics discovered that the most important truths can't be thought, they must be lived. John Scotus Erigena, working in the 9th century, created perhaps the most sophisticated integration of this entire period. His system of 4 natures reads like abstract metaphysics, but it's actually consciousness mapping its own creative process. First, nature that creates and is not created. This is pure awareness, the source. Second, nature that creates and is created. Archetypal patterns, divine ideas. Third, nature that is created and does not create, the manifest world we experience. Fourth, nature that neither creates nor is created, the return to unity. What Erigena was describing is the eternal cycle of consciousness, from unity through creativity into manifestation and back to unity, not as philosophical speculation, but as the actual journey every consciousness takes. What makes this period so remarkable is how it preserved the best of Greek thought while transcending its limitations. The mystics of this era valued reason deeply, while recognizing that the universe held mysteries beyond what rational analysis alone could grasp. The synthesis they achieved was extraordinary: reason as servant to revelation, philosophy as preparation for gnosis, thinking as one mode of consciousness among many. Here's where this ancient story becomes urgently relevant to our time. We're living through a similar crisis. Materialist rationalism, our version of Greek philosophy, has exhausted itself. It can map the brain, but can't explain consciousness. It can sequence DNA, but can't account for meaning. It can build incredible technologies, but can't tell us how to live. Sound familiar? We're discovering that consciousness can't be reduced to neural activity, that subjective experience has an irreducible reality, that some forms of knowing transcend conceptual thought. The hard problem of consciousness that philosophers debate is essentially reason admitting its own limitations, just like what happened in the early Christian era. Let me guide you through an experience that captures this transformation. Find a comfortable position and bring to mind a profound question. Something like, what is the deepest truth about existence? Notice how your mind immediately starts working, analyzing, categorizing, drawing on previous knowledge. This is the Greek mode, thought engaging with reality. Now, keep thinking about this question, but notice what happens as you go deeper. Eventually, thinking begins to tire. Every answer generates new questions. Concepts feel inadequate. you might experience what the mystics called learned ignorance, the recognition that the most profound questions can't be answered conceptually. Here's where something interesting happens. In that moment, when thinking reaches its edge, when concepts fail, there's often a natural pause, a silence between thoughts. The early Christian mystics discovered that this silence isn't empty. It's filled with a different kind of knowing. Instead of pushing for more thoughts, try resting in that pause. Let yourself sink into the space between one thought and the next. What do you find there? Not the absence of knowing, but perhaps a more direct way of touching truth, what the mystics called gnosis, knowledge by being rather than thinking. Here's the crucial point. The early Christian mystics weren't rejecting thought. They were discovering its proper place in the full spectrum of consciousness. They were pioneers of what we might now call integral awareness, the capacity to move fluidly between different modes of knowing as circumstances require. Rational thought for practical matters, analysis, and communication. Contemplative awareness for accessing deeper wisdom, creativity, and meaning. Unitive consciousness for touching the source from which both emerge. We're at a similar threshold. The materialist worldview that has dominated for centuries is encountering its own limitations. We're rediscovering that consciousness has depths that pure rationality can't fathom. But we're not returning to pre-rational mysticism. We're integrating reason and gnosis at a higher level. Science and spirituality, analysis and intuition, thinking and being. The early Christian period gifted humanity with the recognition that consciousness is far more mysterious and magnificent than our concepts about it. They discovered that ultimate truth isn't found by thinking harder, but by learning to be present to what's already here. So, when thought lost its wings in the early Christian era, what actually happened? Consciousness was discovering that it had been wearing training wheels. Thinking wasn't the highest human capacity. It was preparation for something greater. The Greeks gave us the tools of rational analysis. The early Christian mystics showed us the depths of direct spiritual knowing. Our task is integration, honoring both while being limited by neither. You might notice this in your own life. Moments when your carefully constructed worldview encounters mystery that it can't contain, experiences of love, beauty, or transcendence that slip through the nets of conceptual understanding. These aren't problems to be solved, but invitations to expand. Consciousness evolution doesn't move in straight lines, it spirals. We don't abandon what we've learned, we include it in something larger. You're not just learning about consciousness evolution, you're participating in it. The same awakening that transformed the ancient world is stirring in our time. The same questions that puzzled the Gnostics are emerging in new forms through quantum physics, consciousness research, and integral philosophy. Every time you honor both your rational mind and your deeper knowing, you're continuing this ancient work. Every moment you rest in awareness beyond concepts, you're touching what the mystics called the kingdom of heaven. Not a place, but a quality of consciousness. The early Christian era taught us that consciousness is large enough to embrace both thinking and being, analysis and gnosis, science and spirituality. That's not ancient history, that's your birthright and your adventure. When thought loses its wings, consciousness discovers it was never meant to fly, it was meant to soar.